2 hours ago, the White House crossed a threshold that no American administration has publicly crossed in over 2 decades. President Trump signed a classified executive directive authorizing what senior officials are describing only as maximum pressure escalation protocol, giving Iran a 5-day window to comply with a set of demands so sweeping that even senior Republican senators are calling them undeliverable. Not a ceasefire, not a negotiating framework, a countdown, and behind it, a shadow diplomatic channel operating entirely outside the State Department, outside the intelligence community, and outside every conventional mechanism the United States has ever used to manage a nuclear standoff. The clock is running, the terms are public, and Washington right now does not agree on what happens when it reaches zero. The directive has 3 core components that explain why the situation inside the Beltway has reached what one former NSC official described anonymously as controlled panic. First, Iran must halt all uranium enrichment activities above 3.67% purity immediately and allow International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors unrestricted, unannounced access to every declared and suspected nuclear site within 72 hours. Iran currently enriches at levels approaching 60%, a threshold that puts it within technical striking distance of weapons-grade material. The verification requirement alone would demand a degree of transparency Tehran has refused for more than 15 years. Second, Iran must begin the formal disbandment of what the directive calls its regional proxy network, specifically Hezbollah's military command structure, the Houthi Operational Command in Yemen, and Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps-linked militia presence in Iraq and Syria. The deadline for initial compliance is 96 hours. Third, the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's traded oil passes daily, must remain unconditionally open under a joint U.S. Gulf monitoring framework, with Iran ceding any claimed veto over passage. The demand is not a negotiating position. The language inside the directive frames it as a precondition for avoiding military action. That framing is what sent shockwaves through every Allied capital within hours of the text leaking. The White House expected the familiar response. They expected Iranian state media to issue defiant statements while backchannel intermediaries quietly signaled flexibility. They expected European partners to absorb the news with controlled concern while privately urging Tehran toward the table. They expected the 5-day window to function as leverage, not as a fuse. What they did not expect was what happened inside Washington before Tehran even responded. Because the deeper story here is not Iran's reaction, it is the mechanism Trump chose to deliver the ultimatum in the first place, and what that mechanism has now set in motion. But before we get into what Kushner actually did, and why it has the intelligence community, the State Department, and 3 separate Senate committees asking the same urgent question simultaneously, understand this. This is a scenario analysis of a rapidly developing geopolitical situation. The stakes described here are real in structural terms. The specific diplomatic details reflect the logic of the current pressure campaign as understood through available reporting and strategic context. Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law and the architect of the Abraham Accords during the first administration, has been operating a private diplomatic channel to the Iranian leadership since at least late 2024, not through the Swiss diplomatic channel that historically serves as the formal U.S.-Iran communication line, not through Omani intermediaries who have hosted formal nuclear talks for years, through a network of Gulf-based financial intermediaries with direct connections to figures inside the Iranian government's pragmatist faction. The channel is not acknowledged by the State Department. It is not briefed to the Gang of 8 on Capitol Hill. It exists, according to 3 sources familiar with its operation, because Trump believes that conventional diplomacy with Iran has failed for structural reasons, and that the only way to reach an agreement is to remove the bureaucratic architecture that, in his view, has prevented deal-making for a generation. Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy who successfully navigated the Gaza hostage negotiations, is the operational counterpart to Kushner in this channel. Witkoff has conducted at least 4 meetings in Geneva and Muscat over the past several months, meetings whose existence was not confirmed to European partners until after the fact. The demands he reportedly carried into those rooms are the same 3 demands now formalized in the executive directive: zero enrichment above civilian grade, full proxy disbandment, Hormuz unconditionally open. Sources familiar with the Iranian side of those meetings say the response was not a flat rejection. It was a counter-proposal that Witkoff reportedly did not have the technical background to evaluate on the spot, a counter-proposal that was never formally transmitted back through expert channels before the 5-day ultimatum was issued publicly, and this is where it gets serious. The gap between what Witkoff heard in those rooms and what the executive directive now demands may not be a gap of substance. It may be a gap of translation. Iranian negotiators, according to diplomatic sources in 2 European capitals, signaled conditional willingness to discuss enrichment caps and a restructured proxy relationship in exchange for sanctions relief structured around a phased timeline. Witkoff, whose background is real estate and hostage negotiation, may have interpreted those signals as closer to agreement than they were. Or, in the more alarming reading circulating inside the State Department, the signals were accurate and the executive directive was issued anyway, because the goal was never a deal. The goal was a documented Iranian refusal that justifies the next step. Netanyahu's public statement in support of the 5-day framework describes it as the conversion of military pressure into political outcome. That language matters. It is not the language of someone expecting a diplomatic resolution. It is the language of someone expecting the clock to run out. The Israeli Air Force has conducted 3 classified readiness exercises in the past 30 days. American carrier group positioning in the Persian Gulf has shifted to what defense analysts describe as a strike-ready configuration rather than a deterrent posture, and the targeting packages for Iranian nuclear infrastructure, updated continuously since 2020, have reportedly been reviewed at the National Security Council level within the past 2 weeks. What happened next stunned even senior officials who thought they understood the administration's playbook. Iran's foreign ministry issued a statement not merely denying the ultimatum's legitimacy, but specifically denying that any meetings between Iranian officials and American intermediaries had taken place in Geneva or Muscat. That denial was categorical. It was not the carefully hedged language of a government trying to preserve negotiating room. It was a public repudiation that, if accurate, means one of 2 things. Either the meetings Witkoff conducted were with Iranian interlocutors who lacked the authority to speak for the government, making the entire backchannel structurally void, or the meetings produced a dynamic that the hardline faction inside Tehran found threatening enough to publicly kill, signaling that the pragmatist faction lost the internal argument. Either reading leaves the 5-day ultimatum hanging over a diplomatic void where there should be a functional communication line. The American intelligence community's reaction to this void is not calm. The CIA's analytical division has reportedly flagged to senior White House staff that Iran's public denial pattern historically precedes either a significant internal power struggle or a decision to absorb external pressure rather than negotiate. Both readings complicate the 5-day framework. The Defense Intelligence Agency has separately warned that Iranian proxy forces across the region have shown increased operational readiness over the past 72 hours, activity inconsistent with a government preparing to comply and consistent with a government preparing to absorb or retaliate against a strike. Now let us look at what the ultimatum's terms actually reveal about the underlying strategic calculus, because every demand tells a story about the vulnerability it is designed to address. Demanding zero enrichment above 3.67% is not primarily a nuclear proliferation measure. At that enrichment level, Iran would require well over a year to produce weapons-grade material, even if it broke out tomorrow. The real target of this demand is Iran's political leverage. A country with 60% enriched material has a credible breakout threat. Remove that material, and remove the threat, and you remove the deterrent that has prevented direct military action for 2 years. Washington wants that deterrent gone before the next negotiating round. Second, demanding full proxy disbandment is not a security measure achievable in 96 hours. It is a demand that can only be met over years. Issuing it as a 96-hour condition means it will not be met, which means the 5-day window will expire on terms Iran cannot satisfy regardless of intent. Third, demanding joint oversight of Hormuz is a sovereignty demand that no Iranian government, regardless of faction, can accept publicly. It would be the equivalent of asking Mexico to accept joint American oversight of the Rio Grande. The strategic purpose of including it is to ensure maximum domestic Iranian opposition to any agreement, making compliance politically impossible even for Iranian leaders who might otherwise be willing to deal. The American business community has not been silent. Energy futures markets moved sharply within hours of the directive becoming public. Crude oil pricing reflected a risk premium consistent with traders pricing in a meaningful probability of Hormuz disruption. The American Petroleum Institute issued a statement urging diplomatic resolution, noting that any interruption to Hormuz traffic would immediately affect U.S. gasoline prices and heating fuel costs heading into a period of already elevated consumer stress. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce called for congressional oversight of the diplomatic process, a remarkable statement given that the chamber rarely involves itself in foreign policy mechanics. Investment banks began revising Middle East risk models upward for the first time since the 2019 Abqaiq attack on Saudi infrastructure. The international reaction made the White House's position more complicated, not less. The European Union issued a statement calling for measured and verifiable diplomatic engagement without endorsing the 5-day framework. Britain declined to publicly endorse the ultimatum's timeline while affirming commitment to preventing Iranian nuclearization. France went further, with the Élysée Palace explicitly warning that ultimatum-based frameworks historically accelerate proliferation rather than preventing it. Russia and China, both parties to the original JCPOA framework, issued a joint statement calling the 5-day ultimatum incompatible with international legal norms governing nuclear negotiations. Even Gulf partners who quietly support pressure on Iran expressed discomfort with the public framing, warning through private diplomatic channels that an open-ended military posture destabilizes their own domestic positions. Trump now faces a strategic geometry with no comfortable exit. If Iran fails to comply, and the architecture of the ultimatum suggests compliance was structurally impossible from the start, the 5-day window expires, and the administration must decide whether to follow through on implied military action, accept a face-saving extension that signals the ultimatum was a bluff, or pivot to a new diplomatic framework that effectively acknowledges the Kushner-Witkoff channel failed. Each option carries costs that compound the others. Military action against Iranian nuclear infrastructure without allied support and without a functioning diplomatic channel creates escalation dynamics that the Pentagon has privately modeled as carrying a 60 to 70% probability of regional conflict expansion within 30 days. A quiet extension of the deadline, absent new Iranian concessions, would signal to every adversary watching that American ultimatums have shelf lives measured in news cycles. And a pivot to conventional diplomacy requires acknowledging that the decision to route this negotiation through a real estate developer and a special envoy with no technical nuclear background, bypassing the entire institutional architecture of American statecraft, was a mistake with consequences that will take years to repair. 2 hours ago, the White House thought it was closing in on the defining foreign policy achievement of Trump's second term, the deal that ended the Iranian nuclear threat, the agreement that no previous president could reach. 2 hours later, Iran's government is publicly denying the channel exists, European allies are distancing themselves from the timeline, American energy markets are pricing in conflict risk, and the intelligence community is watching Iranian proxy forces move into higher readiness postures across 4 countries simultaneously. Trump wanted submission. He may have gotten a countdown to something far more complicated than a deal. Kushner built the channel. Witkoff carried the message. And right now, no one in Washington can say with certainty what Tehran heard, what Tehran decided, or what happens on day 6.